Happened over the last month? Well, as usual, more things than I can deal with, but I wanted to deal with some of them. I'm going to start off with the economic aspect of the death of Mandela, because there are important economic lessons involved in the death of Nelson Mandela. I'm not going to talk about what a heroic figure he was, what a dynamic leader, what he went through personally, which it really is beyond words, what kind of regime he lived in. Most of the 20th century was a horror in that country. It was an apartheid regime. I assume you all know about it, so you don't need me to tell you about it. But here's the interesting economics of his lifetime toward the end. So he is finally gotten out of jail after a long, long time. And one of the major reasons was the global campaign against apartheid, which was becoming unbearable to many of the major industrial corporations inside South Africa. The gold and mining industry, the diamond industry, and several others. And they were those industries, and if you ever wonder about it, there's a remarkable book by John Pilger, some of you know him, about this, and you'll get much of what I'm telling you in much more detail if you read that. But they made sure to get him out because that was necessary for business. That between what the ANC did inside South Africa and what supporters did outside, they basically brought that regime to an end. And I say that to you because this country, particularly the United States, likes to pretend that mass movements are useless, can't work, don't make a difference, don't change anything. It's very rarely true. It's usually the opposite. South Africa is a dramatic evidence of where you had to do it a long time, but when you did it, it got the result. Well, what then happened is extraordinary. Nelson Mandela, for most of his life, as a political activist, was very close to the South African Communist Party, played a central role in the ANC and in his life. He had very close relationships with Chris Hani, Joe Slovo, and other major leaders that were part of the South African Communist Party, which was a very important political institution. And he therefore often said, and here's where we get the interesting stuff, that if and when he was ever to become the leader of South Africa, that he would immediately nationalize the mines and most of the leading industries of South Africa as part of his basic socialist program. Unambiguous he was about all this. Okay, well then we have an issue, because within a very short time after he became the leader de facto and de jure of South Africa, he changed his mind, and he didn't do it. And the ANC didn't do it. They devoted themselves to social changes in the nature of how white and blacks stood before the law. They changed the society in terms of who had the right to vote and organize. They made many important changes, but they did not go through with the radical economic program that they had espoused for decades leading up to this outcome. As best anyone can tell, the reason for this had much to do with a famous annual conference in a place called Davos. It's a beautiful part of Switzerland, where there are annual meetings of leading industrial economists, government officials, and so on, corporate executives. And he went to the one in 1992 in Davos, where he encountered a very remarkable experience. Two things happened to him there and his delegation. First, he was told clearly and bluntly by a whole host of major corporate and banking leaders that if he carried through his nationalist program, then nobody would invest, that is, nobody being them. They would not invest in the country. They would pull their existing investments out because of fear of being nationalized and not wanting to support any government that did that for fear of that spreading to other countries. That might not have dissuaded him, since it hardly could have surprised him. What probably threw him more were the comments made by leading economists and delegates from Russia, China, and virtually every other socialist country, basically saying to him, we are moving away from nationalized industry and turning more and more of our industries back over into private enterprises, which they were doing at breakneck pace in the early 1990s, particularly in Eastern Europe. So there was no support internationally for him to do what he had intended to do, and so he didn't do it. And so what South Africa became in the last 20 years, 1992, 2013, here we are, 21 years, was a society in which the inequalities of apartheid were drastically reduced. The legal, political, ideological, and cultural condition of the African majority enhanced in countless ways. But the transformation of the capitalist economic system did not happen. So then where are we today, and what conclusions should we draw in this economic update? Well, I'm going to tell you the answer, but by means of a parallel that you may find interesting. In 1789, there was the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, the old economic system was overthrown. Feudalism, French feudalism. A situation in which the mass of people were serfs tied to the land, and a small minority were lords of the land, and the serfs delivered to the lords the rent payment, which allowed the lords to build such things as Versailles and other lovely areas for you to visit these days to show you what wealth feudalism could produce. But the French serfs had had enough. 5, 6 centuries of French feudalism struck them as sufficient, and they decided to get rid of feudalism, and they did that by taking the land away from the feudal lords. The lords were told one morning, you are not the lord of this land, you have 10 minutes to get out of here. When the lord didn't, they separated the lord from his head, whereupon he gave much less difficulty. And they did that all the way up to Marie Antoinette and other people you've seen in movies. So French feudalism was overthrown. And like so often happens in human history, when an economic system is overthrown, there's a bit of blood. Now, the interesting thing was the people who overthrew feudalism, the merchants, the small craftspeople, the small businesses in French cities and even on the countryside, were instituting a new system which we now call, they didn't, we now call capitalism. Instead of lord and serf, we have employer and employee. And here's the language that they used to bring in this new capitalist system. They spoke about liberty, equality, and fraternity, the great 3 slogans of the French Revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, in French. They thought they were ushering in liberty, equality, and brotherhood. That's what the words mean. And that their revolution, their transformation, would give that a reality that would be secure forever. They were very poetic. If you read the speeches of Robespierre or Danton or any of the great theorists of the French Revolution, that's what they thought they were doing. That's what they wanted. Now, to use modern language, we can put it this way. They wanted liberty, freedom, equality, brotherhood, and capitalism. And they thought that by overthrowing feudalism and establishing capitalism, they would secure liberty, equality, and fraternity. 1789. Now fast forward 50 years, it's the 1840s, and there's a young German who's inspired by the French Revolution and its slogans. His name, Karl Marx. Born in neighboring Germany, but in the western part of Germany, so close to France. And he's all excited, as everyone in his generation virtually was, by the enormous romantic appeal of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and a capitalist system that establishes the basis and the structure that'll give us these wonderful outcomes. But he looks around himself. He's a young university student studying philosophy. He looks around and he reaches the following conclusion in mid-19th century Germany. He says, we got capitalism, we don't have feudalism anymore, but we do not have liberty, equality, or brotherhood for the vast majority of people. From which old Marx concluded, or he was young Marx at that time, from which young Marx concluded that capitalism, so far from being the vehicle, the guarantor, the basis of liberty, equality, and fraternity, isn't that. On the contrary, it's an obstacle. The Revolution of France didn't go far enough. It got rid of feudalism, it brought in capitalism, it changed a lot of things, but it left a capitalism which fundamentally blocks liberty, equality, and fraternity. And the rest of Marx's life is working out the theoretical implications of that view, that feeling, that insight. He showed that capitalism is a system that systematically frustrates equality, liberty, and brotherhood. And on that basis, he opposed capitalism and argued to the people of Europe for the rest of his life that if you want liberty, equality, and fraternity, which he did, if you support the ideals of the French Revolution, which he always did, then you have to be anti-capitalist, because capitalism will forever be an obstacle. Why do I tell you this story? Because Nelson Mandela and the ANC, with all their heroism, with all the progress they brought, just like the French revolutionaries brought all kinds of progress in getting rid of feudalism. When the South African government of Mandela made the decision that going beyond capitalism was not practically possible at that time, and I don't question that decision. I'm no Monday morning quarterback. I don't have 20/20 hindsight to tell them that they should have done otherwise. That's not my point. I probably would have done it too. But we have to learn from what we do, whether it's right at the time we did it or not. South Africa today is as unequal a society as it ever was. Alongside of the whites who still dominate their economy, there's now grown up a small but significant African leadership politically and economically. But for the vast majority of the African people in that country, their level of poverty, inequality, whatever the opposite of brotherhood is, all of that, that's what they got. And honest people inside and outside of South Africa know it. I'm sure Mandela thought long and hard about all of this and wondered about his own decisions, as every great leader always has. But there is a message and a lesson here. If you were honest, you'd have to ask yourself this question. 21 years ago, South Africa committed itself under Mandela and the ANC to be a friend to international capitalist investment, to be open to it, to invite it, to facilitate it, and not to take the steps that would scare it away. So we've had 21 years to see whether that would be the road to progress. If you read much of the bizarre celebration in the United States about Nelson Mandela that so conveniently forgets what an enemy of everything he tried to do this country officially was for most of his life, if you try to magic that away, which an extraordinary number of commentators have managed in the last week, if you can put that aside for a minute, you'd have to say, gee, invited capitalist investment that was promised to be the road to prosperity and well-being for South Africa. Shouldn't go in that nationalist direction, shouldn't do those socialist things, they won't work. Do this. He did it. And here we have 21 years result. The result is yuck. You have a society that is falling apart in many ways. Some of the bitterest labor struggles in the world in the last 6 months have happened there, with large numbers of miners going on strike, being shot by the government that runs that society. 21 years of capitalism have not brought that country closer to liberty, equality, or fraternity, or anything like it. And there is a lesson in there somewhere that has a parallel to Marx's understanding that what capitalism was promised to bring to Europe after the French Revolution and what capitalism was promised to bring to South Africa after their ending of apartheid haven't exactly worked out the way the promises were made. Okay, next item, before we get into the more substantive stuff. Report this week that household wealth in the United States rose by 2.6% in the last 6 months. It hadn't risen much before. And that got a lot of attention. I thought I'd break that down a little bit for you. 2/3 of that increase in household wealth, average household wealth, was because of rising stock values. The stock market has had a good 6 months, much better than most people who were looking at it 6 months ago would have expected. So over 2/3 of the increase in average household wealth was stocks. But when you hear that, then of course you have to always remember this statistic. 10% of America's households own 80% of the stocks. So if the stocks have a good 6 months, it's really good news for 10% of the American households. For the other 90%, not so much. The other third of increase in household wealth was rising home prices. So in fact, people's wealth went up because they either had stocks or they have a home. Which means if you're one of the sad 50% or so of Americans who don't have stocks and who don't own your own home, none of this concerns you. None of these statistics refer to you. Your household wealth, as you probably noticed, went nowhere. But this breakdown, which isn't complicated and which any second-year student in economics could tell you how to do, was more than the newspapers and the TV could manage. So I thought I'd remedy the shortfall just so you understood. Third item of the last little while that I thought merited some analysis. When the United States government bailed out the General Motors Corporation back in 2009 and 10, it spent on the order of $50 billion. It did a remarkable thing. It bought lots of stock in General Motors, and it has now this last week sold all the stock that it bought. Giving General Motors $50 billion at that time, buying shares of stock in General Motors, was a very generous thing to do. by the United States government. And one of the ways you can understand how generous it was is that nobody on earth would have done it at that time, and nobody on earth did. Those who had General Motors had been spending the previous 6 months dumping it, selling it, getting rid of it as the disaster that it obviously was. So the United States government, with public money, the money most of you pay in taxes, did an extraordinary service. It bought $50 billion of shares in a company that no one in their right mind would have invested in. It couldn't know whether General Motors would survive. It couldn't know whether it would succeed. It took an enormous risk. Let's do that again. The government risked your money to invest in the General Motors Corporation. And they held the stock until this last week, when they sold the remaining chunk of stock they hadn't already sold. They got General Motors through the crisis, without which General Motors would have gone bankrupt. Bankrupt. You know, like the city where it was located has gone bankrupt, Detroit, like that. Like that. The city of Detroit, which has gone from 2 million people in 1960, when it was the center of our economy, of our automobile economy, to its population today, which is 700,000. The majority of people have been driven out of the city of Detroit in the last 30 years, largely by the decision of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler to make more money someplace else. The government bailed out the company for $50 billion, but allowed over the last month the city to go bankrupt with a net debt of $18 billion. Please keep the numbers in your mind, because we're going to come back to it. When the government sold this last week its last shares, how did it turn out the government did? Compared to the prices they paid the company for these new shares, now they've sold the shares, how did it work out? Well, here's how it worked out. They paid 50, and when all the dust settled and they sold the shares, they got 40. So let's do the arithmetic. It's very advanced arithmetic. The government, your government, lost $10 billion to bail out a company. The company survived. General Motors is doing pretty well. I mean, it's nothing like what it was 20, 30 years ago. It never will do that again. But it's survived, which is more than many people thought. It only had to be bailed out by the government for $50 billion, which they used for years, 2, 3, 4 years, and now the government has sold its shares, lost $10 billion. Oh, well, $10 billion to keep that company going. A company which now makes more cars in China than it does in the United States. But now let's go back to the city, Detroit. Since we last met, bankruptcy in Detroit. It declared is that $18 billion debt. The federal government not bailing anything out. But even more interesting than the government not bailing out a city many times larger than the entire General Motors workforce. City is 3, 4 times larger than the total workforce, let alone the workforce of GM in Detroit. No comparison. Not only did the government not bail out Detroit, in the last week and a half, there was a decision by the bankruptcy court in Detroit that is absolutely epoch-making in the United States. To understand this, which is really important, I have to explain to you how a city like Detroit, which is like many American cities, how it works. Cities and states are not allowed to do what the federal government does. That's the law in the United States. The federal government can borrow money for its regular business. Cities and states cannot do that. They can only borrow money for what are called capital projects, you know, to build a sewer system or build a school, something like that. They can borrow for that, but they can't borrow for regular business. So what cities and states do is they borrow for capital. They pay for their schools and their sewers and their roads and their hospitals by borrowing money. In Michigan, where Detroit is located, at least I think so, Detroit borrowed money. And it borrowed money from creditors, lenders. And it told these lenders, because it's required by law, that there's a clause in the Constitution of Michigan that guarantees to workers who have negotiated a pension with their employer that the employer, if it's a city or a town, cannot withhold the pension. That is an obligation that cannot be negotiated. So everybody who ever lent money to Detroit knew that when you lend to Detroit and you expect to be paid back and have interest paid on the debt, that if you ever have difficulty in Detroit, one thing you can't touch is the money put aside for the pensions of the people who work for the city of Detroit. For decades, the policemen and women, the firefighters, the school teachers, the clerks, the garbage truck workers, whatever in Detroit, negotiated contracts with the city for their jobs and their benefits. Many of those times they took a smaller wage increase in order to have a pension when they retire. They gave up benefits in order to have a pension. The pension was part of what they were paid for the work they did then. In 1970, in 1980, in 1990, they did their job. Police, fire, clerk, teacher, whatever. But the payment was deferred until they reached 65 and retired. This is the way it's done everywhere. What the bankruptcy court decided was that now that Detroit has difficulty, that the federal bankruptcy law takes precedence over the Constitution of the state of Michigan, meaning that what the city of Detroit can now do, since it owes more money than it has assets, is it can not only tell the creditors, we can't pay you back all you lent us, but it can also go to the pensioners and cut their pensions. This is a message to every city in the United States. You got a problem? Stick it to the workers, particularly the ones over 65 after a lifetime of work, depending on the pension. Here, the federal government spent $50 billion on General Motors, but it is watching the decimation of the pensions of old workers. As usual, if I had more time, I'd stop now and I'd just play you the national anthem. So you could sort of take it in and appreciate what a charming piece of music that is. Very profound decision, a very profound revelation of what the priorities governing this society now look like. Final point, who lends to cities and towns and states in the United States? So if the pensioners are going to get screwed, every dollar you take away from an old school teacher is now available to give instead to the creditors, because they want to get paid back. So the ability to not give money to pensioners is good for the creditors. And how do we know that? Because in that courtroom were all the associations of the creditors pushing as hard as they knew how to stick it to the pensioners. It's a nice spectacle, don't you think? The creditors and their lawyers working overtime and succeeding in screwing Mrs. Lacey out of her pension now that she's 74 and can't teach anymore. Again, I'd stop, play the national anthem, but I'll forego all that. Wow. And where does this lead? What are the implications here? The lenders in the United States, who are they? Who lends to Detroit? Well, in order to understand that, you have to understand another law here in the United States. And this law works as follows. If you earn interest on a federal savings bond, in most cases, if you lend money to the federal government, if you lend money to a corporation, the interest you get, you have to pay taxes, part of your income. Just like if you have a share of stock and you get a dividend, that's part of your income. But under the American law, if you lend to a city or a state, the interest you earn on that loan is completely free of income tax, federal income tax. Now that might not matter a whole hell of a lot to many of you because, not to be impolite, you don't have any money. But if you're very rich, this becomes interesting. Because if you're very rich, you pay a high income tax rate because we have a progressive income tax system. People with high incomes pay a higher percent than people with low. That means the richer you are, the higher your tax bracket. And the richer you are, therefore, the more attractive you find a place where you can put your money and earn and pay no tax at all. That's a rich person's excitement, or as close to excitement as they get. Okay? So the lenders to cities and states are the richest people among us. So now let's review. What the bankruptcy court in Detroit did is preserve the interests of the richest amongst us, the creditors of Detroit, and stick it to the pensioners. That's called class warfare. The rich are winning, and you aren't. But it's the real kind of class warfare because it bites right away. Because where, of course, will those old people whose pensions are being savaged? And it's happening, by the way, across the landscape. Public employees, but private employees as well. Many of you are having it happen, or worse, don't even know it, but it's being done in your name and for you at your job, by your employer, by your union, whatever. What do the people do who will not have enough when their pensions are cut? They're going to turn to their kids, aren't they? Everyone is going to feel this bite, not just the people upon whom the bite falls first. It changes the standard of living of all the people who are now going to have to help their elderly relatives in a way that the pension system was designed to avoid happening. It's hard not to get very angry, isn't it? I hope it's hard. Okay. Let me turn then to some larger issues now that I've made you feel good for the first portion of the time. There is something going on, and here I'm part an economist, but part just a citizen like everyone else in the room. There is part of what's going on that I think needs to be understood in a larger framework. This system, our economic system, is understood, I think, in a way that people haven't wanted to face. It is falling apart. At the very least, it's changing drastically, but for many people, it feels like it's falling apart. Not the folks at the top, but pretty much everybody else. And when things begin, even if you're not fully conscious of it, to fall apart, one thing that can happen is a kind of mentality which the French call sauve qui peut, or I think in English is called every person for themselves. Save yourself, because everything has fallen apart. And when that happens, everybody uses whatever resources they have to save their situation. I think what's going on in the United States pretty well fits that bill. Even those at the top are aware that things are in tough shape, in really tough shape. On the way over here, I was walking with someone who told me, I haven't read it myself yet, that in the latest Time magazine, a leading investor in this country, Carl Icahn, literally says the same thing, even though he's a billionaire and all the rest. Warren Buffett says it every other week, and others do too. They see it too. But when a society disintegrates, implodes, falls apart, and everybody tries to save himself or herself, then of course those who have the most are in the best position to save themselves. They have the resources, they have the connections, they have the savings, they have the options. And so if everybody saves themselves, then the worst off are going to be the worst hurt in the process. Something like that is unfolding, because that's what that story about pensions illustrates yet again, as if you needed more illustrations. But it also makes it stark that sometimes, and in some places, that's not what happens. In the 1930s, a depression greater than this one, at least so far, people did not do that. They formed and joined organizations, precisely what Americans are not doing now. They organized and joined socialist parties, two of them, big ones, the Communist Party, and the labor movement, the CIO, by the millions, because they believed that these organizations would help them get through the hard times of the Great Depression better than scrambling around on their own. So people do react differently. And if, in case you think that's only in the past, no, let me give you another example. In Europe over the last 4 or 5 years, where a similar crisis is unfolding to the one we have here, the reactions have been quite different. Massive, organized protest. More in Europe in the last 4 years than in the previous half century. Stunning. Protests now in some countries, and the one I'm going to pick for you in a moment, Spain, where arguably the conditions are now the worst for a large country. Greece is like that, but Greece is a very small country. Spain's a much larger country. Spain is the 3rd or 4th largest economy in Europe. Spain, the unemployment rate now is 27.5%. At the worst of the American Depression, 1933, the unemployment in the United States was 25%. So Spain is experiencing something like the Great Depression of the 1930s, only it's happening now. Demonstrations have therefore been organized in Spain by their communist and socialist parties, by their trade unions, all of which are much stronger organizations there than their equivalents here. It's not even close. So they mount demonstrations. So they do collective protest. And that's one of the reasons why they have a much easier time in this crisis than the United States. The irony of Europe is they protest more even though they're actually suffering less. For example, even Spain, they have a national health service. You lose your job, has no impact on your health insurance, because health insurance goes to every citizen. By definition, you're a citizen, you get health insurance. Lots of subsidies that the government gives, you get, whether you're employed or not. So their experience is a little different. But they do group organized action. Where does that take you? And here's the ominous part of this story. Last week, the government of Spain, a right-wing government, Rajoy, I believe is how you pronounce the president of the country, the prime minister, introduced new laws. And here's what the laws say. If you burn the Spanish flag in protest, if you demonstrate outside of Parliament, the fines that the government can levy on you go from a maximum of 1,000 euros to 40,000 euros. It's called an increase. If you protest and disrupt an election by your protest, make it difficult for voters to get to the polls, which is a tactic often used, you could now be subject to fines of 800,000 euros in Spain. In other words, the government is trying to repress protest. Okay, now let's fast forward. Where's this going? Well, one place it's going is called civil war. You're dividing your society between a majority that are furious with what's going on and an embattled minority that thinks, since everything's falling apart, we have every right to grab whatever we can and hold on to it. And we're not going to be prevented from doing that by some phony social concern. So you have a kind of grabby rich population and a desperate mass of poor people. The future doesn't look good, neither there nor here. And it's no way that I can't tell you that. Because if you pay attention to what's happening economically and you watch the political consequences, it's extraordinary. And the level of conflict in Spain, which is not that different from many other countries, is becoming explosive. The mass of the trade union movement has declared war on those bills if they go through the parliament. Since the right wing controls the parliament, they will become law, and they've already declared they will not obey the law. So what are you going to do? Arrest tens of thousands of workers who do not pay the fine? Now what? How's that going to work exactly? Where are you going to put them? And what are you going to do with the fury of everybody else who's the brother, sister, cousin of all those people you're incarcerating? Where does this go? Where does this stop? I'm sometimes criticized, and I take it seriously, that I'm too much focused on the crisis since 2007. So I want to go back, even though I've done it once with you before, and talk a little bit about the longer run. Because this crisis is a kind of symptom, a kind of moment in a longer run economic development. And in order to do that, I want to look at the American economy since the 1970s, to get a long, kind of a 40-odd year perspective. And I'm going to start with a set of numbers, because it's just an easy way to anchor all of this. These numbers here are what we call real wages. It's the amount of money an average worker got per week, adjusted for the prices he or she had to pay for the goods and services they bought. So it's a measure of how much you can really afford to buy with an average week's wages. So in 1972, in terms of purchasing power, the weekly wage, the average one in the United States, was $341. Last year, the most recent year that we have, it was $294. Okay? That's 14% less last year than was earned in 1972. Let me make sure you understand that. The average American worker working a week earned 1/7 less in terms of what he or she could buy in 2012 than that worker earned 40 years earlier. That's amazing. Nothing like that ever happened in the history of the United States from its beginnings. In the past, wages went up a little more, a little less, but they went up decade over decade until the 1970s, and then they didn't. And then they dropped. They dropped really far back in the 1990s. They recovered some of it, but they're still way below where they were. Over the same 40-year period, the productivity of American workers, what does that measure? The amount of stuff an average worker produces in an hour. We measure that in economics. We measure the goods, the services, how many hamburgers you can fry in that period, how many software programs you can bring to reality, whatever. Whatever you do, we measure. That's all productivity means. So over these 40 years, the average productivity of the American worker, because he or she had better machines, more machines, a computer, they didn't have that back in the 70s, etc., because of all the extra training and extra education, workers were producing twice as much for their employer per hour as they were then. And what was the employer giving them for being twice as productive as they were before? 14% less money. You with me? What happens if the worker gives more and more to the employer, doubling what he or she provides to the employer, and the employer pays them less? You know what happens? Profit goes mad, because you're giving more and more to the employer to sell while he has to pay you less for doing it. That's why we have in the United States 1% and 99%. That's why the rich have become extraordinarily rich and you haven't. And you're not gonna. Unless you're part of the people who employ. Unless you're part of the people who get profit. Who gets profit? People who are on the board of directors or people who own shares? 10% of the people own 80% of the shares. Those 10% cash in. And the top executives, well, you know what they get. They give themselves a lot. I'm sure they're worth it, but they give themselves a lot. So we have an economy that has become unlike any in the history of the United States for 40 years. Now, what's this about? Many answers, but I'm going to, because of time, I want to focus on one, because I want to drive home to you what it implies for your future and mine. In the 1970s, American corporations, having realized that they were paying very high wages, all those famous high wages that made the American worker the envy of workers around the world. The worker who had a car, and the worker who had a home, and the worker who had a TV, and the worker, all that. American corporations were acutely aware of how much they were paying American workers. American workers fought hard for their high wages, but American corporations were doing so well they could pay them, and they did when they had to. So by 1972 and thereabouts, American corporations were acutely aware of the fact that they were paying high or higher wages than anywhere else in the world. But they were also acutely aware of things that were happening in the world that changed everything. Number one, jet travel became possible to go anywhere on this planet in a matter of hours. The internet and telecommunications, meaning you could monitor a factory thousands of miles away as easily as you used to monitor the one down the street. And American corporations said, wait a minute, we have spent 200 years. European corporations said the same thing, and Japanese corporations. We spent 100 to 200 years building up our capitalist success here in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. We've been so profitable that we've been able to pay high wages to our workers. True, we had to rip off the rest of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, destroy their economies, reduce these people to a level of poverty that's illustrated by another thing that happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the UNICEF and the UN declared something with the unlikely name, which caught my attention right away, World Toilet Day. Yes, that's what I said, toilet. Turns out that the UN is upset that 3 or 4 billion people, half the population, doesn't have toilets. They don't. They do what they do where they are, and they get sick as a result. A lot of health problems from bad sanitation. That's the nice way to say it. Don't have a running toilet, and you don't have one inside. So they have a big campaign to bring toilets to billions of people. Capitalism has been around for 3 or 4 centuries. And there are a third or more of our people who have no toilet. That's called uneven development. There's other words you could use, but that's a nice one. Why do I say that? Because the wages that were high in Europe, North America, and Japan were the other side of a coin of disastrous wages in Asia, Africa, Latin America. The same economic capitalist development concentrated itself in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, and concentrated the disaster it imposed on other parts of the world. But that brings us to 1972 with the jet engine and the internet and telecommunications, and there's a eureka moment of the corporate structures in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. The eureka moment is, what the hell are we doing here? We should be producing, which we can now do with jet engines and telecommunications, we should be producing where the wages are so terribly low, because then we can get more profit. That's how it works. And so they began a mass exodus. I enjoy using biblical reference when I can. A mass exodus driven by profit. Leave Western Europe, leave North America, leave Japan. Go to Bangladesh, Uruguay, Nigeria, China, India. You know. You all know that. And so what happens in the United States? The jobs disappear. The people are here because it turns out Americans don't want to go to Bangladesh. They don't have toilets. So the people stay, the jobs disappear. And now you know why that happens. There aren't any jobs. People compete for the jobs. The people who are still here compete for the jobs that are still here, that are a shrinking phenomena. And the wages go down and down. And the profits go up because every employer enjoys the benefit of paying workers less. Not just Wall Street, Main Street, every street, the employer does that. Meanwhile, the employer who's getting lower wages here is getting even lower wages over there in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Profits up, wages down. 1%, 5% doing very well, everybody else not. Detroit becomes the disaster it is, followed by Cleveland and Camden, New Jersey, and Youngstown, Ohio, and thousands of others. It's important you get, by the way, it's continuing, goes right on. Why? Because no matter what happens in this country, even as the wages get ratcheted down, footnote, that settlement between the government and General Motors, when the government bailed out General Motors, the government of Barack Obama, went to the UAW, the union that represents workers at General Motors, and said, we're going to save General Motors, which you want as a union because it keeps your jobs. But in order to do that, you have to agree to a new arrangement, a two-tier wage system it's called. We will allow you to continue to get the wages workers in the auto industry have been getting, which were around $29 an hour. But all new hires, as of 2009, all new hires will be paid $16 an hour. Wow. You want to know why Detroit's a disaster? Because even as the auto companies are doing well and hiring a few extra people, they're hiring people at poverty-level wages. Of course the city can't survive. That was part of the deal. You save the company and you screw the city. Even as the wages come down, it's not enough. How do you compete with Bangladesh, where you pay people a certain number of cents an hour? Not dollars, cents an hour. Impossible. It's going to take years years, years. And when you read those stories in the newspaper, there's a new jobs being found in this industry or that industry in California or Arizona. You're talking about incidentals that are in the newspaper precisely so you don't see the longer trend, which the statistics make absolutely clear, no matter what your political persuasion is. Well, here's the meaning of all of this. Capitalism for 200 years was able to go to the American working class and say roughly the following. Yes, all the power is in our hands. Yes, we're making ourselves rich, and you will never be. But you ought to let us do what we're doing because we're giving you a job and your income is slowly rising. We give you the wherewithal, after you're done working in our factory where we tell you what to do, we give you the wherewithal to go to the mall and have a good time. That's what we give you. And so we became a culture that, of course, celebrates consumerism, because that's what the mass of people get out of this situation. Pretty much it. You work to get the money so you can consume. Something you have to tell a population to whom you give nothing else, so that they can value what you're willing to give them and not miss what you do not give them. But what will happen in the United States in the years ahead when it becomes clear to the American people that there's a New Deal, not like Roosevelt meant it? Here's the New Deal. We're going to make all the decisions. We're going to tell you what to do all day. We're going to make a lot of profits, and your income's going down. Hallelujah. Because that's the deal now. Wages are going up someplace else. You may be surprised to know that there's been a significant increase in wages in China over the last 2 years. Big one. Just as the wages are coming down here, they're going up there. You hadn't heard about that. I wonder why. I wonder why that might be. Look it up. You'll see. Now, the wages are very low there. That you know about. But that they've been rising quickly, you probably didn't. And if you think that's an accident, I will sell you a 4% interest in the Washington Bridge at the end of the meeting. Capitalism is offering something in the areas of low wages because it is no longer offering that here. And what does it mean to the ability of capitalism to survive even for another few decades in a society to which it is saying, the good times are over. You're going to scramble for what you get, and what you get is less than what your parents got. And your grandchildren are going to look upon you as having lived in the best of all imaginable times. That's where things are going. No wonder the Spanish government is clamping down. No wonder, if I can provoke you a little bit, that somebody is paying a lot of attention to your emails and your phone calls. Why might that be? Why might that be? Maybe somebody understands that things are unfolding here that are going to be causing trouble because they are a radical change of the history of this country, which was a history of rising wages and is now a history of falling wages. The political implications of this are enormous, and I would like you to think about them between now and February, when I hope we reconnect, and everything will have become immensely better. And all of this will be a bad memory of an evening you should not have gone out. All right, next item. Next item. And you'll see a certain logic to all of this. This is a lesson in economics, but it's one that has a lot of implications for the daily news. I don't mean the newspaper, but the news we get every day. The price of anything can be decomposed into three parts. one part of the price of this folder or my jacket or a table or a chair or your necklace or whatever it is, one part of the price of that is when the employer gets that price for selling it, the employer uses it to pay for the materials that are in that object. The wood, the plastic, the paper, the electricity it costs to run the machine, all of that, part of the materials. And another part of the price pays the wages. And another part of the price is the profit to the producer, the employer. That's it. That's what price covers. And prices are what they are so that the employer can pay for the materials and keep being in business, pay the wages so he can keep being in business, and earn the profits so he can keep being in business and go to the Bahamas. Okay? But this has implications for you when you listen to the radio or the TV. So let's start. Suppose wages go up. Does that mean that the price of something will go up? Well, if nothing else changes, yeah. If you're going to pay the same for materials and give the same profit to the employer, then when wages go up, so will prices. But now suppose, this is not complicated. Suppose when the wages go up, ready? The profits go down. Then the price wouldn't have to change at all, would it? So the sentence, gee, when the wages go up, the prices have to go up, is wrong. It's always wrong. It's illogical. It's kind of dumb. And none of you wants to be dumb. So don't be. What this also suggests is that if you wanted to keep prices constant, you could do it by raising wages and lowering profits. That would be a way to do that. This would be charming for workers and unpleasant for employers. Gee, so what? Here now it's going to get better. We here in the United States, we are told, we can't compete with other countries because for us it costs, I don't know, let's pick something, $25,000 to make a crappy car, okay? Whereas in India and China, they can make a crappy car for, I don't know, let's say $19,000. The numbers don't matter. And we say, gee, wow, we are going to be competed out of existence. Our car companies are going to die. Of course we could do better if we didn't pay those high wages. If we brought the wages down, then we could lower the price. True. That's true. But the following sentence is equally true. If we brought the profits down, we could also compete more successfully in the world. Workers are not the cause of our economic difficulty in exporting our goods around the world. Workers are not the cause of why we don't buy Chevys as opposed to Toyotas, etc., assuming that they're made in the places of their origins. It's really important that you understand that. The corporate executive who talks about the need to be price competitive always means that we'll bring the price down by paying somebody else less, never by paying me less. And how much does the corporate executive get who's talking about the need to be competitive? $40 million a year in many of the big companies. Gee, he could make a significant difference in the price just by taking the executive salaries and cutting them in half. What are you doing? All the way down the line of the corporate leadership. What is this? Where did we get this strange willingness to be told that the problem is the wages? Strange. But it would be a very good idea in a society that was cutting wages for entirely different reasons, to make more money by going abroad. Now let's follow the same logic, look at the same little diagram, and analyze something else. General Motors leaves the United States and produces cars. Well, I'll use the same thing. And they're going to save a ton of money. The wages are now this little sliver here, because they're in China. They're in China, and they pay nothing. Now, if prices were as linked to wages as corporations would like you to believe, then the price of everything made in China would have to come down spectacularly. Do the companies do that? Never. Never. They bring the prices down a little. Let's say here. The price has come down. You don't have to pay $60 for that sweater at Macy's. You can pay $42 for that sweater at Marshall's or TJ Maxx or Kmart or the dollar store or whatever the next step down is, if there is a step down. Okay? Why do they go there? You think they go over to the other side of the world to put production and then bring the price down so they're making about as much as they made before? That's not why they do that. They don't drop the price as much as they save in wages. Not even close. This is a program to get more profits. So they drop the wages spectacularly, and they don't drop the prices anywhere near that amount. But when challenged about the damage done to the workers they fired, to the communities to whom they no longer pay taxes in the United States, to the devastation their departure has left, their answer is always, hey, if you Americans want to have cheap stuff, then you have to allow us to go to where it's cheaper to make it. Wrong. They only cut the price a little after they can cut the wages a lot. So they bring the goods back here, develop specialized stores to sell you the lower price stuff that they make an enormous profit on. That's why Walmart is everywhere, and the stores it replaces are a dim memory in everybody's mind. That's the way a price is set up. That's the way the economics of it works. Corporations go abroad because they make more money doing that. The benefit to the American consumer is small. So small that it works out, if you do any kind of economic examination, that the United States has been a net loser from this operation. The corporations who do it keep wanting to have you believe you're the beneficiary. You can go to Walmart and pay very little for this. Let's review. You pay very little? Let's see. So poorly are the workers at Walmart paid, I'm sure many of you have noticed this in the last few weeks, that it turns out that a huge proportion of Walmart employees qualify for food stamps, qualify for housing assistance, qualify for Medicaid. Get the picture? Well, let's see now. That means the low wage of the worker that gets you the low price at Walmart costs you not just the low price you pay for the t-shirt you bought, but the extra taxes you have to pay to provide the food stamps and the housing assistance and the Medicaid to the workers there. So this is costing you. It's costing you a lot. But we're just beginning. When Walmart comes into a town, on the edge of town, and sets up one of those malls that I'm sure many of you have seen, and decimates the little shops in the middle of town, so that most centers of American towns look a little ghost town-like, with all the empty stores, guess what happens? The revenue to the local town depletes. To get Walmart to come, they have to often give them tax holidays and all kinds of concessions. So they do that to get Walmart to come. That destroys the local businesses. The local businesses don't pay taxes to the local town. So how's the local town going to pay for garbage collection and the schools? And they either have to cut those services or tax you who live in the town to make up for what those defunct businesses with the storefronts that are empty. Gee, you'd have to add that. That's a cost to you, either foregone services or extra taxes. Whoa, now you're having to pay extra taxes for food stamps and for housing vouchers and for Medicaid, and now you have to pay extra property taxes to your town to make. When you finish and sit down and work it all out, you're not saving on the T-shirt. You're losing on the T-shirt. But if all you think about is the T-shirt, then Walmart wins. Then you don't see the game. You don't understand it. Walmart understands it perfectly. They know what they're doing. The job is to portray it by focusing you on the one thing that is an advantage, a cheaper T-shirt, and not on all the other consequences of how you get the cheaper T-shirt. No more production jobs. T-shirts are not made here. Walmart sources its T-shirts around the world. They find the cheapest place to make a T-shirt. And if that is in an unsafe factory building upstairs in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and 1,000 people die in a fire, collateral damage, cost of business. They go around the world. They find the cheapest place. They make every producer compete with every other. I'll buy it from Indonesia. I'll buy it from Bangladesh. I'll buy it from Uruguay. I'll buy it from Kenya. Doesn't matter to us. We're Walmart. We'll take it all in. What they love to do is to go to a producer in one part of the world and say, and I don't mean to pick on Walmart. I enjoy that, but I don't mean to pick on Walmart. What I'm saying is true of many stores. It doesn't matter. You find a producer, and you say to that producer, this all is very sad to watch historically. You say to that producer, hey, you're producing, you know, X thousand of whatever this is, briefcases or belts or whatever it is. We're Walmart. We'll take everything you produce as fast as you produce it. And if you can get the money to become a bigger producer, we'll take everything. And the person is so excited he's now going to go from a small or medium-sized business to a big one with Walmart as the customer or Target. I have to say it that way. I've been corrected. I cannot say Target. You can't, like that British comedic program. Remember, you ever seen that Hyacinth Bucket? Who explains to everyone that she's Hyacinth Bouquet. So she has to be that, right? So Target store, and any of the others. And then the game is played this way. After the producer has become big, because they can sell all this large quantity to the big store, and the big store says to them after 2 or 3 years, hello, we would like to change the price we pay you for what you produce from 20 to 16. The big producer says, I can't make any profit like that. Gee, that's too bad. But they know they have him because he's producing so much, he's no way he can sell it to anybody else. He'd have to hire an army of people to get rid of that stuff. They have him. And at that point, they go, and then they go down and down and down. So the story is repeated 1,000 times in 1,000 enterprises across the world. All of that has to be calculated. The destroyed businesses, the consequences for the workers who worked in that destroyed business, the Walmartization, the large store, the box store, whatever you want to call it, has had incredible effects on the economy. But the propaganda that those stores put out is about whatever the positives are they can deliver to you, and all the other negatives are pushed out of the story. But when you bring them back in, as any rational assessment of what they are about would require you to do, you begin to see that the cheap T-shirt isn't cheap at all. Very, very important that you understand that. Okay. Last thing for today. The mayor's race here in New York has forced onto the agenda a couple of issues, and I wanted to leave them with you because my guess is between now and the time we reconvene in February, a good number of these issues are going to be resolved, or at least look like they'll be resolved. Okay? So the first one, and I'm only talking about the economic issues. The most important appointment of the last little while was probably the police commissioner, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. But I do hope you all pay close attention to what that means or may mean. We will see. But there are crucial issues. City employees in this city have not had a wage increase for years. They expect to get one, and they expect to get one that compensates them for the years they got nothing. And the governor of this state is likely going to run for president or something like that and want to look like he doesn't raise taxes and doesn't spend money and all the rest of what passes for political reputation in our strange society. So we're going to see a mayor of the largest city in a very, very difficult situation, and we're going to see whether there's something there in the way of mobilizing the population to get solutions other than those that are normal in American cities. And I think the decision in Detroit, which by the way is similar to a decision that is likely going to come when the state of Illinois is able to do to the public employees in that state what the city of Detroit had done to it, that there will be calls by those who are running the city normally, the wealthy banks and others in this city, to begin to deal similarly with pensioners in the city of New York. And that is going to have an enormous impact on the economy of New York and, for those of you who understand it, on the economy of Florida, where an enormous amount of pension money paid by the state and city of New York ends up because people retire from New York and go to Florida. And you will see struggles in which Florida people will be present in the courtroom, and you won't understand why, or the reporter won't even point it out to you. But now you understand that this is an epic struggle. And for all of you, including those of many of you in the room that are young, you know, a pension may seem like something, you know, far away, it has nothing to do with you, but it will change the neighborhood, it'll change the economy, it'll change your job prospects, it'll change a lot of things as we continue to be a society that ratchets down its wage situation, ratchets down its public services. Your standard of living is based on what you can afford to buy with your own income and what the larger society, the government, provides for you, whether it's a public park or a pension for your grandmother or anything else. All of this, there used to be this joke, you know, pecked to death by ducks. Everything is a little bite here or there, but the cumulative effect is you die. I don't want to suggest that you're all about to die, but I do want you to understand that you are surrounded by a society that is breaking down, that cannot deliver to the majority of the people what they need and want. Not because it doesn't have the capacity. It does. We have more than enough capacity to provide a very high standard of living to all our people. This has nothing to do with physical capacity to produce. The statistic I know I've mentioned to you several times, I'll do it one more time. We currently have somewhere between 15 and 20 million people who want to work and have no job. According to the Federal Reserve, 20% of our productive capacity is idle. 1 out of 5 machines, 1 out of 5 tools, 1 out of 5 square foot of office space, factory space, and store space is being unutilized. If we put together the 15 to 20 million people who want a job with all the tools and equipment and machinery and space they need to work with, which we have sitting there doing nothing, the output of wealth could solve all the wage problems, could fix the city of Detroit. It wouldn't take any time at all. We're talking an amount of output which, if you just do the numbers, is in the neighborhood of $1 trillion. The total debt of Detroit, a city of almost 1 million people, is $18 billion. So stop. Of course we have the capacity. Of course we could do it. The problem is not our physical capacity. The problem is not the raw materials, the tools, the skills, or anything else. The problem is an economic system that can't put these things together. An economic system where profit is the bottom line, and therefore the profiteers, the folks who live off profit, have chosen not to hire the workers, not to use the material, not to produce the wealth, because that's what's profitable for them. They're playing by the rules of the system, as they keep telling us, and which is true. But the corollary and the implication of that is if you don't like the outcome, you've got to change the system. If you don't like the outcome of 21 years of South Africa's commitment to free foreign investment and protecting investments and maintaining a capitalist system, then you've got to change that system. If you don't like to be repressed by the Spanish government because it is crazy to allow 27% of your people to be unemployed. By the way, the unemployment among the people below 30 is over 50%. That's why huge numbers of Spanish people are leaving, young people are leaving Spain. And you have to wonder where they go to. They're going to places where the unemployment is only slightly better. Where do you go in this world? They could go to China, but they're not likely to. They could go to India, but they're not likely to. So where do they go? They go someplace else in Europe where they're not welcome and where there aren't growing job opportunities either. Even, last point for today, even in the one country in the Western world that has really done well, not the only country, but the most important one, Germany. The results this last few weeks, not good. Germany's economic growth is slowing drastically. And here's the lesson. Why? Because in the end, the Germans, who were able to export to the rest of the world and become successful and provide a lot of jobs for their people by producing for exports, guess what? If you're an export country, there has to be someone to buy the exports. And if the way you develop is to impoverish the countries to whom you sold your exports, and in the case of Germany, that would be Greece, Spain, Italy, get the picture? The irony is we really are all parts of a society. And if the rich keep taking it and impoverish everybody else, they in the end will be killing the goose that lays the golden eggs they've been collecting. And then they will discover what it means to be in a society. You can't keep tearing it apart. And that is what we are doing, and that is why, despite the fact that I really don't want to leave you in anything other than an euphorious kind of mood, I do have to tell you that the situation, which many of us did not think would come to this level, keeps coming to this level. And if you have a political system like we do, that is bought and paid for by those who have the wealth, do remember this. Those at the top in this society, they know very well what's going on. And they've long ago understood that precisely because the gap between rich and poor is getting so as extreme as it is, that there's always going to be a temptation in a society that has voting for the mass of people to use the one person, one vote system to try to use politics to undo the outcome of the economy. It's your natural, logical idea. If you can't do much about the situation on the job, use politics. And those at the top understand that, which is why they have been so careful over the last 20 years to make sure they run the political system so it cannot do to them what it otherwise might. Only if the mass of people understand that will they understand and grasp that they have to organize and mobilize themselves if they're going to change this situation. If they do, they can. That's why I keep telling you the story of the 1930s. Not because it's the best outcome one could imagine. It wasn't. They didn't get rid of capitalism any more than Nelson Mandela got rid of it there. And we're now paying the price. But they were able to change the rules of the game. They created Social Security. They weren't taking away people's pensions. They created the pension system. When there weren't private sector employers willing to hire millions of Americans, Roosevelt created and filled 15, 20 million jobs. That was done because the people below were mobilized. That shows you what can be done. That's what's most frustrating for those of us who are economists, who see the situation and who explain it or try to, that the next step is up to all of you. You've got to build the organizations and mobilize to make a different story from the one that's unfolding now. It's been done before. It can be done again. But someone's got to do it. Thank you very much for coming.